En los créditos de la película dice que te inspiraste en un artículo de Rolling Stone para ir a Arizona. ¿Qué fue lo que te llamó la atención del artículo de Rolling Stone?
So I was riding in the subway in New York, and I read this Rolling Stone article called Border of Madness about these groups operating on the Arizona side of the Mexican border. And it was a world that I knew nothing about. I knew very little about the border. I knew very little about the drug wars, and I knew very little about vigilantism. And so I reached out to the journalist. We spoke many times. He introduced me to Nailer, Tim Nailer Foley, the main character on the Arizona side. And it took several months to gain his trust and gain access to him. And we filmed there for 4 or 5 months. And then my father actually sent me an article about the autodefensas. And right when I read it, I knew I wanted to create this parallel story of these two different groups operating on both sides of the border, but with a shared enemy, the Mexican drug cartels.
Justo como dices, creo que la película intenta generar una especie de espejo. ¿Qué similitudes encontraste entre los dos movimientos de autodefensa?
At its heart, are these two main characters, El Doctor and Nailer. And they're both 55 years old. They both believe that the government has failed them. They've both taken the law into their own hands to fight for what they believe in. But the circumstances are quite different. In Mexico, the violence is real. It's visceral. 80,000 people, roughly 80,000 people killed since 2007. 20,000 plus disappeared. Whereas in Arizona, that violence is much more theoretical. It's much more of a fear that these drug wars in Mexico will seep their way into the United States. So there's similarities, but there's stark differences as well.
Cuando llegas a México, ¿cómo entras en contacto con las autodefensas?
So after my father sent me the article about the autodefensas, I did some research, I read some articles, I reached out to a journalist, and she connected me via email to the doctor. I think that night we got on the phone. I told him I want to come down, I want to document your story, I want to document the story of the autodefensas. And he said, come. And 2 weeks later, I was down here filming.
¿Quién es el Dr. Mireles?
Like metaphysically or like...
Like a character.
Dr. Mireles is a surgeon from a small town in Michoacán who is one of the leaders of the autodefensas. He, like many other people, for many years lived under the fear and under the control of the Knights Templar. Lived in a society where he believed, and many other people believed, that there was no government institutions, that it was a failed state, and that even if there were government institutions there, they were either not effective or directly working with the cartel. And so he and several other leaders helped begin the autodefensive movement.
Después de pasar tantos meses con tus personajes, como director, ¿cómo logras mantener la objetividad frente a ellos?
I think that's my job, is to try to remain objective, to not I'm not a big fan of agenda filmmaking where people bring their own preconceived notions into a story. I think our job is to document history, to document the story unfolding before us. A mentor of mine in the film world once told me that if you end up with the story that you started with, then you weren't listening along the way. And I think that's good advice, not just for life, but for filmmaking as well. And that very much, was something that I listened to in making this film.
Que en la sinopsis de la película se compara con un western. Al igual que esas historias, esta no tiene ni buenos ni malos.
When I first got started making this film, just from reading, news articles and doing research, thought that I was telling a very simple story. A story of guys, men and women, rising up to fight against evil. People in white shirts fighting against people in black shirts. And very quickly I realized, not very quickly, but over time, I realized that the lines between good and evil were much more blurry, much more gray. It was much more complex. And that complexity is part of what drove me to keep making this film, to try to understand what was happening.
Después de estar con ellos, ¿crees que los dos casos de autodefensas que presentas son legítimos?
I think that's a question that I constantly ask myself. I constantly ask myself, what would I do? What would I do if my sister was raped by the cartel? What would I do if my brother was hanging from a bridge? Would I grab a gun? Would I fight violence with violence? Is that just? Is that right? Is vigilantism sustainable? These are all questions that I constantly wondered and asked and thought about. And I hope the film provokes those same questions in you. What would you do?